the question and answer period if he doesn't say this. So, as I've said several times in the course of the day here, this is a person who confronts the troubles and dilemmas of our times, looks at them directly, does not flinch from that, and then leads us to actions, ways of thinking that deliver hope and give us our grounding, give us our footing, give us traction. And I could go on at greater length, which would just make you crabby because you didn't come to hear a long introduction. You came to hear Dan Wildcat, so it is really my privilege to introduce Dan Wildcat.
Agdasua. Thank you very much, Patricia, and thank you, everyone at the Center for the American West. And I've just had a great visit today with my wife, Myrn, and we've really enjoyed Boulder a lot. Fasan, Zoyaha, Yuchi ha, Kadane, Azadeh. Good evening. My name's Dan Wildcat. I'm a Yuchi member of the Muscogee Nation of Oklahoma, and I'm beginning to feel like Boulder is my second home, because I've been very fortunate, really, in the last 5, 6, 7 years, really, to build a relationship with people who usually you wouldn't associate a person who does really necessarily policy analysis, history, philosophy. You wouldn't identify a person like me who does those kinds of things, of working with scientists at NOAA and at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and then UCAR, the University Center for Atmospheric Research. But I've been very fortunate because for the last, really, 6 or 7 years now, my focus has really been on trying to address some of the incredible and life-threatening challenges that indigenous peoples are facing. Primarily, my focus has been in the Americas as they see the dramatic effects of climate change in their homelands, in their seascapes and their landscapes. And so, naturally, a lot of the work, kind of modeling and the scientific analysis of that phenomenon, it goes on at NOAA and at NCAR. So I get to be out here quite a bit, and but it's a beautiful university. My wife and I like Boulder, and so we're just glad to have this opportunity to visit tonight. So when I was asked to do a presentation tonight, and this shows that Kurt, I don't think, didn't know much about my sort of approach to these things, because he asked me if I was going to need a computer for a PowerPoint. And I said, I don't do PowerPoints. I said, this is as close as I get to a PowerPoint, and this would be a sort of what I would call a Yuchi PowerPoint. So watch very closely. That's it. That's a Yuchi PowerPoint. So, and I will cite Vine on this. I think Vine's attitude towards people who every time I went to a meeting with Vine, he would always say, don't do a PowerPoint, don't do a PowerPoint. And I heard recently a scholar say, I think what was in Vine's heart, and that was, he said, I'm not going to do a PowerPoint because what I found through experience that usually people who use such presentations have no power and they never make a point. And so we're going to avoid that. We're not going to go that route. So I'm going to tell some stories and talk to you a little bit about this idea of Indigenuity. And then I want to talk to you why I came up with this kind of crazy title about sort of exercises of indigenous ingenuity, Indigenuity, in an age of Cybernations. Where do I start? Well, this is a good way to start. A good way to start is to say that I think one of the great missteps of modern humankind is to buy too fully and too wholly into something called the nature-culture dichotomy. And I think that dichotomy, in fact, has been miseducative to our institutions, whether those be economics, whether those be politics, whether those be science itself. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is to the extent that since humankind became mindful that we had histories and were making histories, we became self-conscious of making histories, that until very recently, the cultures that we participated in, where we found our identity, were literally emergent out of the landscapes and seascapes that we called home. This is a simplification, of course, just to be provocative. Our cultures were literally emergent out of these environments, these ecosystems, these landscapes and seascapes, where our physical culture, our clothing, our dwelling, our food, our technologies, our behavioral features of our culture, our custom, our habit, our ceremony, and our symbolic features of culture and communication. Language, the kind of iconographs that we use to identify who we were as native people. On this planet, everyone, we share a much richer heritage as humankind, as peoples. If we look cast that long gaze back in our people's histories, we would see that until very recently, everyone in this room, your ancestors were members of tribes before they were members of nation states, citizens, I should say, of nation states. Nation states are a very recent phenomenon in human history. And I would argue that one of the things that you can 7th graders, 8th graders get it the first time they have to take a geography course. They get it just immediately. That when you start asking them how you understand the incredible diversity that exists. Is this too loud or too?
No, we have another issue. Don't worry.
Oh, okay. Okay, I just want to. If I'm hurting your ears, let me know. I'm speaking rather softly for me because I've got this mic on. But if you get with 7th or 8th graders and you start talking to them about Seminoles of Florida, and you talk to them about White Mountain Apache, Western Apache of Arizona, start talking to them about Lakota, Dakota, or Nakota speakers of the Northern Plains, or the Dene of the Four Corners, or the Anishinaabe, the Adawa of the Great Lakes, and you start asking them simple questions. Do you think the homes that the Seminoles lived down there in the Everglades, what we call the Everglades today, look like the homes of the White Mountain Apache? And of course, you've been talking to them about geography, and they look at it, well, of course not. They lived in very different places. Was their clothing similar? Well, no, not really. How about their diets? Some overlap, but very unique. Is it surprising that in ceremonial life, the central feature of the ceremonial life of Plains Indians surrounded the bison? And they go like, well, of course not. Do you think that, the Coast Salish people, in their ceremonial life, the central relative that they honored creation with was a bison? They go like, no, probably not a bison, but salmon. They had salmon ceremonies. Plains people had ceremonies surrounding this relative, this bison. My people, and this is one that spreads fairly widely across the United States, many of us, particularly in the South, had corn, became the central relative that we acknowledged. And so, basically, I think what we've got to do is to recapture a sense in which we avoid what modernity, and particularly since the Industrial Revolution, has led us to believe, and that is culture, particularly as it's embodied in technology, is something that we use and think about to change nature, or now it becomes the environment, to fit us. See, that's how you know you're civilized. When you can control the water. When the mountains are no problem if you have enough explosives. You can build a hole right through the center of the mountains. And we think about civilization, we think about progress, primarily in those terms. In fact, nature becomes something that we make great efforts to control or appear to control. And now culture takes on sort of this relative autonomy to landscapes and seascapes where people live. They're tools. We carry them with us wherever we need them, wherever we use them. Of course, this is an extreme. I mean, it's never deterministic in this way. And so in my work, and this is greatly indebted to Vine Deloria Jr., I started thinking, well, what we need to do is we need to recognize that it's not this one way or the other, but we need to think about this symbiotic relationship, wherein, point one tonight, we have to restore the symbiotic relationship between peoples and place, cultures and nature. And if we don't, I don't think the planet will be able to handle the kind of life systems that it currently does. Right now, the one-size-fits-all culture that some institutions in the world seem to want to export all over the world seems to suggest falsely that wherever humans go, biological diversity declines. Which makes me wonder sometimes if we haven't become the invasive species of the planet. Are we the weed species of the planet? Well, this is the good news. The answer is no, we aren't. Because we're not hardwired to behave that way. And we have examples, luckily, throughout the world of people who in their very recent memory and history can call upon traditions where they were still engaged and still continue to engage in a symbiotic relationship of people and place, of nature and culture. Indigenuity is a term that is one of these just fortuitous things that happens when you're teaching a course. And I cite the student. This is a term that a student wrote in a paper for me. And he said, we were talking about technology all semester. And he said, in a course I teach called Native and Western Views of Nature. And he said, I think when we talk about technology, we're not talking, technology bad or, technology is going to solve all the questions. He says, what we're really talking about, we've got to figure out ways to apply indigenous ingenuity. And then he collapsed the two. His name's Curtis Kikaba, member of the Kaw Nation, of the Kansa people. And he said, what we're talking about is indigenuity. And I thought, man, that's it. That is beautiful, And of course, about 6 months later, I was working on a spec. I said, Curtis, I'm going to cite you in my book because, that's what we were talking about all semester, but you named it. And I said, can you give me that take-home exam you wrote? He said, I threw that away a long time ago. He was on to the next course, right? But nevertheless, that was something I was really impressed by because indigenuity. The challenge is, and I've got a lot of allies. Any of you in here that have been involved for at least 2 decades, maybe 3 decades, in talking about what constitutes appropriate technology, isn't that indigenuity? The technology you employ should fit the site, the place where you're going to use it. There are some places where it's not going to be feasible for you to use wind energy. There are other places where it's not feasible to use photovoltaic energy, solar energy. You have to consider the place. We don't live in nature in the abstract. Or do we? Is that part of the problem? Is part of the problem that basically we spend so much time in environments such as we're sitting in now throughout our days and lives that let's be honest, if this is the basic environment that you live your life in, should you be surprised that people complain about us thinking in boxes? We live in boxes. We educate our children in boxes. I'm going to forewarn you. People always ask me, what's my discipline? And this is my story, and I'm sticking to it. I'm an undisciplined scholar. I don't fit neatly in any discipline. You know, I've got an undergraduate degree in sociology and a minor in philosophy, and I got a master's degree in sociology, and then I got a degree, really got an Ph.D., an interdisciplinary Ph.D. at the University of Missouri, Kansas City at the Block School of Business and Public Administration, where I put together public administration and policy as my core discipline with a co-discipline they called the Social Science Consortium. Because I could never figure out, after I enrolled in this program, they said, oh, we have an interdisciplinary program. And so I was waiting to go to those classes where I'd have an anthropologist and a public policy person and an economist all teaching a class. I found out quickly there is no such thing. No, interdisciplinary meant I had to go take courses in all these areas and then take comprehensive exams in all those areas. Man, was that ever a ripoff? I didn't know it was going to work like that. Oh, that's interdisciplinary. We're going to give you all the pieces. You just throw it together. But I'm glad I did it. I'm glad I had a lot of support to go that route. So the good news is that I think the overwhelming nature of the primary problems we are facing today are of a cultural nature. I don't believe we're hardwired to destruction. Now, there would be some scientists who would disagree with me. I beg to differ. And I would point out the fact that, we have an advantage still of looking at people who've spent incredibly thousands, hundreds of years in locations where they've lived relatively sustainably. But then we get to the big challenge, and this will be the second point I'd like to talk about tonight. And I'm going to try to make 4 points and stop there. And I'll probably be a little bit provocative because I'm not going to have a chance to lay out every piece of the argument in a comprehensive fashion, because I do intend give you the opportunity to ask questions. So let's accept the fact that we're not some sort of environmental or determinist along this route. We're not going to accept determinism along this kind of unidirectional way. But we are right here. This is where we live. We're right in this nexus in our daily life. This nature-culture-environment nexus. So what's the second point to make? Well, I think the second point to make is the following. Indigenuity. So what does indigenous ingenuity look like? Well, let me try to give you 3 very quick examples. First of all, I would argue that the greatest opportunity we have to immediately employ some very profound and technical insights that indigenous people had would be in the architecture and design of their traditional dwellings. Now, that stated, I don't mean that, again, someone says, oh, Wildcat wants us to all go back and live in teepees. No, we don't have the bison anymore, if you've noticed. We're not going to do that. Okay? But we have examples of teepees. We have examples of earth lodges. We have the Pueblos, the first apartment builders on North America. We have grass lodges. We have, and where my homeland was in Georgia, we were one of those groups that was removed along with all the members of the Creek Confederacy to eastern Oklahoma. We spent most of our time, 7-8 months out of the year, living in dwellings without walls. We lived under arbors. We didn't need walls. And what I find very interesting is that as much as we're doing sort of, in terms of, looking for LEED certification for this, whether it be gold, platinum, or silver, that we really haven't investigated what we could do in some fairly immediate steps just in design, in opening up the places where we work and live. And I think we would be better for it if we had walls and windows that were open. Of course, that means you have to unplug your headset, turn the music off, so you can take full advantage of hearing, what's around you. Architecture and design is incredible. We had a gentleman come on our campus and help us build a switchgrass arbor. And what I found out about switchgrass, which I didn't know, is that switchgrass is extremely wind resistant. It has a high insulating factor, switchgrass thatch. It breathes, although it has this incredible insulating factor. It breathes. It allows an air exchange between inside and outside. And I'm thinking, so where are the materials engineers and scientists that are looking at how could we come up with something like a switchgrass, material to make walls in homes out of? I would say that's a very high-tech application of Indigenuity. But it's going to take some work. It's going to take some real work to entertain those kinds of experiments and do that work. Architecture is a great example for us to start. I think another example, and this is the one that I think is rapidly catching on, I think the whole local food movement is incredible because I think that is the ultimate indigenuity. And you try to not only grow your food locally, but we start pushing even further into looking at what were the indigenous edible plants of this particular region or where you call home, and investigate, cultivating those, building a relationship with those. After all, those would be the plants that would have the longest historical, evolutionary kind of connection to a particular place. And in its niche, within an ecosystem. So I think, food, what we could do with food would be incredible. And that I'm glad to see that Muscogee Nation, Creek Nation, has a food sovereignty project. I know a lot of tribes, ttä౦န့Ɂ now in Kansas, the Prairie Band, are starting a food sovereignty, a gardening project. And so when I know there are communities, probably here in Boulder, that are looking at these notions of neighborhood gardens, local gardens, that's a good exercise of indigenuity. And I think we ought to be looking at that very seriously. Now, this may seem rather strange, but I did tell you my background is in public policy and administration. And I'd suggest to you that there's an insight that we can honor that comes from some Native traditions. You can't say all, this is the point. We were so incredibly diverse that, I try to avoid making, global generalizations about indigenous peoples. But there's some things that were fairly widely shared, although not always understood the same way. I've talked a lot to people from the Haudenosaunee, or what's sometimes referred to as the Iroquoian Confederacy. And, they talk a lot about this 7 generations concept they have. And their concept is very much, 7 generations, into the future and how we ought to think about that when we plan. I've heard another version of that from a Dakota man who said, well, their understanding of 7 generations, and it just seems to be... It resonates with me because when I think about this, I can kind of relate to it. And they said that, what he said is, every one of you lives in the 7th generation. But to be cognizant of that, what you have to think about is the knowledge that came from your parents. Here you are. You're in the middle. From your parents, your grandparents, and your great-grandparents. You have to have that gaze, that acknowledgement that your great-grandparents, your grandparents, and your parents had knowledge that was practical, that was useful, and that we would do well to heed today. But as we make decisions about the future, forget these 10-year, 25-year, 2020 plans. What we should do is we should use 7 generations thinking. So we're thinking we're going that 3 generations back. We're that center generation right now. Each of you is in the 7th generation in this model, in this the way I describe it. And then you think about your children, you think about your grandchildren, and you think about your great-grandchildren. That's the frame of reference through which we are cognizant and really involved in some sort of circumspection about what we choose to do and what its consequences will be. I would argue that's a fairly practical and reasonable way that we might think about making decisions about land use, about water, about energy. So Indigenuity is really this rejection of the notion that we should find a one-size-fits-all, a magic bullet, a magic pill that's going to solve the problems we're facing here. The problems we face and how we address them have to be related not to nature in the abstract, whether it be human nature or the other than human relatives we share this planet with. It has to be very grounded, literally, in that place where you live, in that place you call home. Native people have a lot to share in this respect and to offer. So that's my second point. If we take this seriously, I think there's an attempt to really do some fairly radical experiments with this kind of exercise of indigenuity in our thinking, in our behavior, and in our institution building. So, I hope that's good news. Now, the bad news is that I think we have to accept the fact that the dominant institutions, such as universities, I'm not going to tell the story about universities, Patty wants me to, but maybe after tonight I'll tell it. But Vine always used to say that Vine Deloria Jr., that universities were the most conservative institutions on the planet. We think of universities as great liberal, change agents. And you just think about it. Think about how we confer, highest academic accolades and honors. It really hasn't changed since the earliest, universities 500 years ago in Europe. I mean, we still have, you have to basically, be judged and evaluated by the other people who've studied the whole thing. And you have to read all their work and understand it. And anyway, to make a long story short, we've got very tough work, and the challenges are real when we look at how we are going to change institutions in this society. Whether those be economic, whether those be political, or those be education. But this isn't an exact quote, but something like this is always attributed to Albert Einstein, who was observing colleagues who repeated the same experiment over and over and over, and yet expected to get a different result each time. And I think that's one definition for insanity. You shouldn't expect a different result. We've been trying the same thing over and over and over. And so what I would like to modestly propose, and I think we have allies, many allies. We need allies. We need people who are recognizing the same institutional and very powerful structural failures and obstacles we have to try to address some of the dysfunctionalities we find in the world today. I would like to suggest to you that it's time maybe to honor and not romanticize in any way, but honor the First Nations of this land and their own intellectual traditions, their own intellectual heritage. And this is going to, that's a pretty radical statement because, this kind of linear view of history would sort of propose the notion that there wasn't anything valuable for Lakota peoples or Anishinaabe peoples or the peoples of the Southwest, Apache Pueblos, Dene peoples, or those Coast Salish peoples. There wasn't anything that they could offer, the people who came, to this land from afar, to this shore. Well, I would beg to differ. Certainly our histories were interrupted with a colonial imposition of government and economic systems that were not ours. Okay? And so I think we have an opportunity now It's fraught with all kinds of challenges. But to say, let's try something different. Let's try and see if we can understand what would happen. And I'll go through my quick list. This is just a very quick list, and it's much more profound than it'll seem, because these aren't just like a shopping list. So what would be an example of how you could change institutions, and what would be a cultural example? Well, one cultural example would be, I would recommend to you that we would do well to look at linguistic traditions and cultures on this land of people who never had a word for resources in their vocabulary, but who instead saw plants, animals, the land, air, and the water itself as relatives. And if you took that seriously, the way we would conduct ourselves would change very dramatically. You don't treat your relatives like resources. Not in my family. You'll get put in your place very quickly. If the only time you show up is when you need something or want something, that kind of ATM model, of relatives isn't going to cut it. And yet, I would put forward to you, isn't that the model we've been operating with on this planet for the last 200 years? We've been doing a lot of withdrawals from the planet. We haven't been putting much good back into it. And that's because we treat relatives like resources. So I would say there's some fairly sophisticated consequences to adopting a worldview where you would begin to conduct yourself in terms of acknowledging the balance of life on this planet other than human life as having value, intrinsic value, and that the real question is, how do you conduct yourself in a responsible, in a respectful way in your human life? I don't think that's romantic at all. I think if you want to find a romantic ideology and a myth, try the one where it says that man's in charge of the planet. I think that's one of the largest myths we have. We're not in charge. We have a tremendous impact on the planet. So people ask me, so the fourth point is kind of, the good news is the second point. We do have some examples of things we could do some serious experiments with. Architecture, food, even new models of planning and social organization. The bad news is the institutions that we find ourselves in are fairly well established. And it is not easy to kind of, think within those institutions that you find the space or room where you can do this kind of innovation or indigenuity. So you've got to find those, you start creating those spaces. Maybe alongside of, maybe where there's a little vacuum in an existing institution. You just try to find those places where you can do that. Now, here's my fourth point, and then I'm going to stop. Because why do I have this discussion of indigenuity in the age of cybernations in the presentation? Because I talked about living in boxes, but with the advent of little boxes like this, we're reaching a point now that makes the ruminations of Marshall McLuhan, Lewis Mumford, Buckminster Fuller seem prescient, seem right on target, and yet so underestimating in some ways of the power technologies would wield in shaping us, enfolding us into their systems. And what I mean by this is a short story, and I'll stop. I started thinking about, remember where I started over here in talking about our long history as humankind on the planet and the way to understand indigenous diversity, American Indian, Alaska diversity, Alaska Native diversity, indigenous people all over the world, is to realize that we took our identities from these landscapes, these environments. They gave us our identity. They made us who we were. Okay? That's why Dene people aren't like Anishinaabe, and the Passamaquoddy aren't like the White Mountain Apache. And it's beautiful. We've got to reconnect that nature-culture nexus. But I've got a story to tell you. I'm not going to tell you what tribal college it happened at, but I was doing a presentation, and they have a substantial reservation. And I had a teacher come up to me afterwards, and he said, Dan, I've got a question for you about this. You keep talking about environment and nature. And he told me about a field trip he took with Native students of this reservation into their landscape, off the road. They got off the road and took a walk. And he told me how in this group of students, he had 3 students that were absolutely terrified. They thought bugs were on them all the time. They were afraid something was in their hair. And they were absolutely terrified. And he says, come on, you guys. You've been out here before. And they said, no, we've never been out here before. We've never been out here. These students all had these. They all had earphones. They all had the telephones where they could text and do all that. And so he came up afterwards and he asked me, Dan, what happens if this becomes, for all intents and purposes, their environment? Think about it. If this is where your attention is focused, it makes it real easy to be neglectful to that balance of nature beyond these walls, to the land, to the plants, to the animals. We're living in a room full of mirrors where all we look at is ourselves and our creations, our human creations. And it makes us forgetful. It makes us irresponsible. So, I got to thinking about this Indigenuity, exercises of indigenous ingenuity in an age of Cybernations. And I mean that in sort of like machinations, Cybernations. But literally I got to thinking of, I stumbled on a book that was recently published, within the last 10 years, of some lectures that Marshall McLuhan used. And, Marshall McLuhan is famous for predicting that we would all be connected. He forecast the social media, predicted it, and he said what it would result in was a global village. And in fact, in this context, I was not aware of, till I read these letters, his lectures, I was not aware of the extent to which he talked about tribalism in his lectures. Both good and bad, but in some ways he talked about a retribalization of humankind, because he was fairly optimistic we might come to some common shared understanding that would make the notion of a global village make sense. I think we can all attest that it hasn't quite turned out that way. And I think because there's something that Marshall McLuhan missed. I think actually Lewis Mumford probably did the best job. If you read the series of books, he started in the 30s and culminated with The Myth of the Machine, The Pentagon of Power. In that book, he's very straightforward about his fear about applications of technology and fear to the extent that we would become part of the technology. Literally, technology would no longer serve us, but we serve technology. Seems to me we're very close to that point. Very close to that point. And it creates this incredible, disorganization in our lives, psychologically, spiritually, socially. Because you don't have to pay attention to where you are. I mean, you're
somewhere else.
I'm going to read you a quote from my mentor, Vine Deloria Jr., and he was addressing this issue. I thought about it today, and then I looked it up this afternoon because I wanted to read it verbatim. And it's going to sound fairly ominous, and I think it should be. Now, I want you to know this was written in his classic work, God is Red, and he was addressing Alvin Toffler's Future Shock, which had just come out, and he was talking about Buckminster Fuller and Marshall McLuhan. And he said, it looks like we're not going to be Spaceship Earth. We're going to fail that experiment. And it also looks like, we're not going to become the global village that was anticipated. And this is what Vine said. The world is therefore not a global village so much as a series of non-homogeneous pockets of identity that must be thrust into eventual conflict. Because they represent different arrangements of emotional energy. What these pockets of energy will produce, how they will understand themselves, and what kind of mini movements they will produce constitute one of the most urgent questions of our time. We're there. The Middle East, Central Asia, Latin America, Africa. And here's the good news. Vine talked about one other thing, and I'll quote him. He said, that the main challenge we had was not necessarily intellectual, it was one of maturity. That humankind had created a culture that fostered immaturity. That we live our lives never fully grown up. And we have not yet acknowledged that we're part of a much larger family on this planet, and that life on the planet is not all about us. Now, the irony is, if we would acknowledge that, we would indeed live better ourselves. But we would certainly allow for my contribution in this discourse. So in Red Alert, you'll see in the last chapter, people always ask me, so you're against progress. And I thought about that a lot. No, I'm not against progress, but I want to avoid that term. It's so incredibly culture-laden and has all this stuff tied into it with, modernization and industrialization and applications of technology. So I kept thinking, what would be something I would offer as a zetě, as one Yuchi sort of alternative to saying, okay, so Wildcat, what are you in favor of? And so what I think we should all be working for is the establishment, the enactment of systems of life enhancement. That if we would think about how we could live in ways that would enhance not only our lives, but the balance of life we share this planet with, that we would start recognizing maturity that I think much of the balance of life on the planet hasn't seen yet in our lives and in our conduct. So there is hope. Let's enact systems of life enhancement. It's going to be hard work. There's a place for scientists, to be engaged in that. I'm not anti-science. I'm not anti-technology. What I'm saying is we can't continue to do these things in the boxes that we've constructed thus far. And I think we've got some great indigenous models that we could look to that could help us maybe not keep repeating the same experiment over and over and getting the same life-threatening results. Thank you very much. I'd love to have questions or comments. Questions, and if you'll just and stand up, please, and speak loudly. You don't have microphones, I do. So,
I was wondering if you're familiar with the organization Architecture for Humanity.
I am very much.
It sounds like it would be a wonderful mix.
I think this architecture for humanity, and then there's also an organization that I think relatively recently formed. We've got Doctors Without Borders, but now there's an Architects Without Borders, I think, that's getting organized. And I think these are hopeful, opportunities. Now, I'm hoping that the architects aren't going to take their prepackaged plans with how they're going to build those homes and just go to these places, but are actually going to talk to the communities and look at the landscape or the particular environment where we need to build dwellings, and really maybe listen to what people there could tell you they want and what they need. And so, but I think that's a space there where I think there's real opportunity. So thanks for bringing that up. Yes?
Okay, so on the radio, and how we hear essentially about writers that have to stay for retirement, and it's such a stressful thing because no one ever has enough money to retire in a perfect world. So what would you recommend if we were to learn from Indigenous tradition on how to prepare ourselves for the future?
Thank you for a great question. That's a great one, and I'm going to try to answer a short version. So the short version is this. The greatest segregation problem we have in the society we live in is age segregation. We send our children off to be with children. We send our old people, our elders, off to live with elders. And we have native traditions where entire extended families shared a lodge. And we were better for it. Because we learned something about humility, patience. I'm very fortunate that, I have a wife who decided with me a long time ago that we did not want to put our parents in a nursing home. Now, this was our decision. We said, no, we're not going to do that as long as it is feasible. And you don't need, the kind of medical attention. My wife's parents both lived with us. They both died with us. And I learned something in that. I learned how frustrating it was. It wasn't easy. But it told me something about myself. It made me realize something about, my own limited time on this planet, and thinking about what I needed to realize someday. I was going to be that person that was going to be driving my son nuts. And I think, again, what I would argue is that we need to re-envision communities and living arrangements where we try to avoid this incredible segregation we do by age in our society. I can think of a lot of people who I'd love to come in and spend time with children, older people, And I think we'd be better for it as human beings. And so I appreciate that. So I'd be thinking maybe in home design, community design, to try to figure out how we can create communities where we can live in closer proximity and be serving each other. So, that's another deal. I mean, I'm not an architect, but I like architecture. And what I've read about the new urbanism and some of that to me really might be another space where there's some real opportunity here, creating, these village enclaves within what were these, inner city wasteland. I mean, that seems to me that'd be great. I'd like to be able to walk to work. I'd like to be able to not have to, bus or send a child clear through traffic to go to school. I don't think that's romantic. I think that's realistic. We would consume much less energy, particularly carbon energy, and we would build a stronger social fabric. And I think that's something that's very much threatened in the way we live today. Very few of you, I suspect, live in communities. You live in neighborhoods. You live in suburbs. Do you know your neighbors? I hope you do. A lot of people don't. They don't know who lives behind them, in the lot behind them, or 2 houses down. Oh, they know their names, but do you ever have a meal together? This, I think, is again an excellent example where we have some examples within indigenous traditions that we ought to re-explore. Thank you for the question. You bet. Yes.
I am a doctoral student at the University of Colorado, Denver.
Okay.
And something that you said really kind of reminded me of a lot of my fellow doctoral students that are not going to be graduating probably ever have a lot of that sense of Ingenuity.
Yes.
And I just was wondering if you could comment or have any suggestions for surviving that higher look as far as a doctoral student.
You're going to make me tell this story about higher education, aren't you? Okay? Yeah. The question. This young lady's a Ph.D. student at University of Denver. University of Colorado at Denver. She has many of her colleagues, Ph.D. candidates, who she says she thinks they have a lot of indigenuity, but she's not sure they'll survive the system that they're in. And so now I have to tell the story. So, my good friend and mentor was invited to give a plenary address at the Western Social Science Association. And I tell you what, I think Nick Peroff, who was the president of the organization at the time, was really hoping after Vine was done, he'd get out of that conference room alive. People were not happy campers, because here's what Vine said. I remember 3 of his main points. First thing he says is, I want to know why academics are such cowards. Why are you afraid to challenge people in the institution that you're in with when they have theories that you know have weaknesses, could be improved, and that no one seems to want to ever publicly challenge these things. And so he basically called all the academics in the room cowards. Now that didn't go over real big at an academic conference. And then he says, you know, we've got to change the way we do graduate education. He says, because I'm tired of hearing the old senior faculty emeritus sit around and complaining about how these young scholars don't have the discipline and can't come up with an original idea on their own. And he said, well, let me tell you why that happens. It's because you put them into a system where once they identify a topic, the first thing you tell them they have to do is read everyone in that field and understand everything that they've said. And after a student's tackled that, they're lucky if they can put a coherent sentence together. Because the range of theories on any given topic is so strange. And then you come down with the real hammer and you say, now we want you to come up with an original idea. And he said, you know, they're lucky if they can put together a coherent sentence. Their brain's been just overloaded with this stuff. And he says, this is what we call a doctoral Ph.D. process. And he says, I don't call it that. I call it indoctrination. I don't think he used the word quite that harsh, although it sounds like something Vine would have said. I don't think he used indoctrination. But he said, you know, here's the problem. You've created a system where, you know, you get what you put in, to this whole process, and what comes out, that's what you get. And so here's what I'd say. I'd say what you do is you find those faculty members like a Patricia Lemerick. You find scholars and scientists like, Elizabeth Holland. You find people like John Echohawk at the Native American Rights Fund who understand the nature of the systems that we're in and sometimes how stifling they are. And you get with them and you say, help me find just a little space here and support me so I can do something a little bit different. And there are those people out there. You have to search them out. You have to search them out. And Dan Wildcat wouldn't have a Ph.D. today if some people hadn't given me a space to sort of do something that was kind of different. you know. Yes.
I wasn't going to ask a question because all the native people in here, I'm sure we all know each other and we all ask the same questions. So thank you for your response. We have the same mentor. My mother was his TA at University of Arizona before I was born.
Your mother was?
Marlene Hosky.
Ah.
So she was Vine's TA, and so I read Vine at 6, and I read Vine at 36.
Good for you.
And I chose to work at University of Colorado because that's what I knew, and he passed on before I was able to be full-time. And it's an oxymoron to work at a university and have indigenous knowledge. And what my question to you is, what is either your most used Vine quote, or personally and professionally, but the one that is most meaningful to you?
Boy, that's an almost impossible question.
You have to pick one, though.
Yeah, I have to pick one.
Because I asked my mother that same question, and it changes each.
Right. Probably any given day.
30 years.
Yeah, probably any given day. My
one. So if I ever do presentations and quote you, I want to be able to use that on a PowerPoint.
First of all, don't ever use that on a PowerPoint now. You're really crossing the line here, okay? Remember, that's memorable. That wasn't Vine's words, but that was his sentiment. You know, he didn't want to see PowerPoints because, you know, usually the people who present them don't have power, and they usually don't make a point. And so that was kind of Vine's flavor. But a quote. Well, I'll tell you, the best advice I think he ever gave me, and I try to stay true to it, and you can see if you agree if I've accomplished or fallen short. By way of a short story, why is Vine Deloria Jr. probably remains the most well-known, and most American Indian scholars aren't, but in the general population, the cultural landscape of the United States of America, why is Vine Deloria probably the most well-known? Because if you go back and look at his books, Custer Died for Your Sin, God is Red, We Talk, You Listen, Red Earth, White Lies. If you look at the vast majority of his books, he avoided academic jargon, and he tried to talk about complex ideas in fairly straightforward English language and prose. And the best advice he ever got me, and this is very appropriate to young scholars, when he asked me, would I contribute chapters? He says, I've got this little book, Indian Education in America, and I want to redo it, but I need to put some more stuff in there. So I want you to write these chapters, and we'll situate them in between mine. And that is, Power and Place, Indian Education in America. Vine Deloria Jr. and Dan Wildcat. So, man, I was just, overwhelmed. God, this is great, So I stopped working on my dissertation and started writing these chapters. And I remember I sent him some. Now, I don't have these emails. I wish I did. But I got back, like one of the first emails I got back was, good work, Wildcat. Who's going to read this stuff? And I was going like, what? Who's going to read this stuff? And so I immediately got on the phone and I called Vine. I said, Vine, I'm not quite sure I understand. You said good work, and then who's going to read this stuff? And he says, well, you're writing like a real academic intellectual. And he said, is that who you want to read this book? He says, if we're going to have a real change in our communities, he said, you need to take that jargon out of there. And you need to write so that your aunts and your uncles could pick up the book, and maybe your nieces and nephews, and they could take something valuable out of it. I think the reason Vine Deloria Jr. is so well known, and his writing and his intellectual capacity is so well respected, he never went the academic jargon route. He tried to talk about complex ideas in ways that would resonate with the people that he wanted to have his ideas have some consequence with. Not just Native people, but non-Native people too. We need all the allies we can get. These institutions we are in are very rigid, very structured. So I would suggest, and so, this would be, we'll ask my cousin Wes. He'd be a good judge on this. He always calls out people who are blowing hot air. And he's hiding back there. See, I don't think he wants to come into the room and be identified as my cousin yet. He's going to wait and see what the reaction is. Is it safe to say I'm Dan's cousin? But I'd say, this is the deal. If I give a presentation like this, I can look at Ruby, I can look at Wes, and if it's BS and coming off a little academic. I was at NOAA one time and Ruby was in the audience and I was talking and I looked down and she started going like this. And I thought, uh-oh, I better kind of change the way I'm trying to articulate this. So, that really impressed me. I thought, that's really what it's all about. I don't want to write a piece that, if I'm lucky, 60 or 70 other scholars around the world are going to read and cite. I'd like to write something that would have some real efficacy and consequence for families, communities, and nations that are too often, our intellectual heritage is ignored and overlooked. And that's where I'd like to have some consequence. So I don't write. I try to avoid academic writing. I try to talk about real issues that are fairly complex, but I'm not as good as Vine was, but I still try. And Red Alert, I hope if those of you pick up Red Alert and read it, I hope you'll say, okay, I get what he's doing. I'm talking about one of the most, perplexing aspects of the world we live in today, the larger environment, but it's very much focused around climate change. But I wanted to do it in a Native voice, in a Yuchi voice, and just not with all of the coloring of scientific terminology and the like. I admire scientists. I admire engineers. I'm not those people, so I'm not going to try to write like they do. I'm just going to write straightforwardly. So that, I think, was good advice, and I've tried to use it. I don't know how successfully, but I've tried. One more question, and then maybe if you want to talk, we can visit out here in the lobby or...
Going back to your nexus and your dichotomy, you brought up some terms of Native Americans respect the plants. Well, you're really talking about spirituality.
Absolutely.
Animistic views. And in this system, the system that we've been taught here is they separate the spirituality from the physical. Our people are spirituality, are spiritual people. So that's the hard concept. When you come into an institution where it's the dichotomy, a dual thinking worldview, it doesn't mesh. So our people respected the plants and the animals. Yes. And so you got to factor that in with our people.
Absolutely.
The spiritual part of it. And I never heard that.
Well, yeah, and I appreciate you for asking that question because I haven't talked about it. And here's what here would be my simple response, and it's a simple one. That doesn't mean that there isn't a lot that surrounds what I'm going to try to state fairly succinctly. I think that here's a good way. I'm going to quote another elder I have a lot of respect for, Dr. Henrietta Mann. Some of you, a lot of the Native people in the room will recognize that. She was a guest faculty member at Haskell about 15 years ago, and she gave a lecture one time to the students, and I was sitting in. I wanted to hear what Henry had to say. And she said, I'm always amazed that in the society that surrounds us, everyone's trying to find their spirituality. Go to Borders or Barnes & Nobles. The largest book section is about spirituality. And people are over there trying to find a book so they can find their spirituality. And she said something, and to me this is the bottom line. This is the simple answer about the fundamental spiritual nature of our existence. She said, in our Cheyenne ways, she says, we know we are born spiritual persons, and our challenge is to struggle. We are born spiritual beings, and our challenge in this life is to figure out how to be human beings. Kind of turns it totally around. Science is all about our human beingness and our species and all of that. And she says, no, in Cheyenne ways, we start first and foremost with we are born spiritual beings. We are in this world spiritual beings. What's our struggle? We're trying to figure out how to be human beings. I appreciate the question, and that's would be the topic for a much longer discussion than probably what we can do tonight. But thank you. I would have been remiss if you hadn't asked that question and not pointing that out. So thank you very much.